in the middle of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, another potentially fatal disease breaks out in Africa in 2022. Mpox. Is the world once again threatened by an epidemic? Fortunately, the situation has eased again. But in August 2024, the World Health Organization once again declared a public health emergency of international proportions. Even if Mpox is not caused by a new virus, a variant has broken out that leads to more severe cases, and one that is currently affecting many people in the Congo. Epidemics are often caused by viral diseases that are triggered by new or mutated known pathogens. And then the question quickly arises: how is this virus transmitted, and how is transmission influenced by our immune system? Dr. Julia Port is dedicated to these questions and has already been able to answer them for SARS-CoV-2 and Mpox. She heads the junior research group Transmission Immunology at the HZI, where she combines basic research in a relatively young field of research with global health.
I'm sitting here in the HZI library with Julia Port. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Julia.
Julia, why was an international emergency declared again in 2024 by the WHO?
For the same reason that they initially also declared one in 2022. So it's actually a public health emergency of international concern. So it's basically already in the name. It has to be of international concern. So kind of a declaration that we have a disease that's causing so much damage to human lives or society or the economical situation of affected countries that we are worrying because of human life lost or just disease burden in general. And it is becoming so transmissive or so transmittable across country borders that we're worrying it might become an international pandemic.
Okay.
So in essence, it has to have that aspect of it's so much of a health burden, A, and B, it's becoming so much of a transmission burden that we think it is of international relevance because the damage to the whole of humanity could be significant.
Is the Mpox virus of 2024 the same as the one of 2022?
Not exactly. So basically, Mpox itself has existed for decades, or we've known about it for decades. And traditionally, there have been two different clades, clade 1 and clade 2, that were sort of assigned to different geographical regions in Africa because that is where they were mostly found to be endemic. And the 2022 outbreak, similarly to, I think, the 2018 outbreak in Nigeria, was caused by clade 2. And then the 2022 one became a subclade of 2b. And that is what was responsible for that outbreak. And it's still circulating, actually. It's not completely gone. But the current outbreak of the Democratic Republic in Congo is actually caused by clade 1. Majorly by a new clade 1b that appeared now for the first time.
Okay.
And is also related to a lot of human-to-human transmission, but there's also circulating continuous spillover events and outbreaks from clade 2a, which is the traditional clade 1a, the traditional clade 1.
So I think it's very, very complex. And there are two clades
with two subclades each.
But in general, what kind of virus is it? Is it linked to the smallpox virus?
Yeah, it's also a pox virus. Basically, pox viruses as a family have evolved with different species for a long, long period of time and have sort of adapted to their specific host of choice. So smallpox was the one that was kind of circulating in humans. Mpox is kind of misnamed, which is also why it was previously known as monkeypox, because it was first found in a monkey, but that is actually not the reservoir species of this pox virus. We don't know what the reservoir exactly is. Probably a small rodent or a small monkey in that is found in Central or East Africa, and it is basically adapted to that reservoir species, and now causing spillover events and human-to-human transmission as well. But in as much as that it's similar to smallpox, the vaccine is actually cross-protective, which is also one of the suspected reasons why we're seeing an upsurge in monkeypox cases now, because the smallpox vaccination has been stopped, and basically the population that was protected is dying off.
Okay, yeah. And how is the Mpox the transmission way? How is it transmitted, and who is particularly at risk?
So maybe we separate in endemic transmission and epidemic transmission. So classically, when we looked at endemic transmission, which is what we saw for the last 50 years, it's normally started by a small spillover event from the suspected reservoir to most likely a child. And then we had some within family, human-to-human transmission or healthcare setting transmission, but it was very localized and small clusters. And then now we have these newer subclades, so 2B and 1B, that have more human-to-human transmission, though we're not super certain yet if this is virus intrinsic capabilities or if by chance they have managed to access transmission routes that just previously weren't as prevalent.
Okay.
So therefore, the transmission itself actually happens because you have contact with the virus. Traditionally, if you're interacting with this reservoir species, maybe because you have a broken wound, you have a bite, you're handling animal pieces for whichever reason, you're going foraging or hunting in the forest. And with human-to-human transmission, the risks are because you're having contact with your skin or mucosal surfaces with contagious liquids and fluids from an infected person. You have basically very close skin-to-skin contact. You may have potentially transmission through droplets when an infected person is exhaling them, though that is not the major confirmed route. It's truly just close personal contact, which is also why the sexual route is very easy for this virus.
Okay. And how can you protect yourself from Mpox? And how dangerous is the virus actually for us? You mentioned the vaccination.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with how dangerous this virus actually is. I mean, if we look at the case fatality rates, there's actually been past outbreaks where the case fatality rates were higher to a degree where you would say this is truly life-threatening for a lot of people if this would become a global outbreak. Of course, in addition to lethality, there is morbidity, and it's truly a disease I would not wish to have or would wish on anyone to have, because the sores and the pustules, and it can be extremely painful. So it's very is not like having a mild case of SARS-2, for example. So is it super dangerous in regards to high mortality? The answer would be no. Is it dangerous from how well it transmits? Currently, the answer would also be no, because you still require this close human-to-human contact. And in essence, stopping close human-to-human contact should be quite easy, because the only thing you need to do is tell people to stop having that close contact or use protective measures to reduce the risk of being exposed to a fluid that is containing the virus when having close contact with another person. So that would also be the suggestion of how you can protect yourself. Basically, if you are in close proximity to a person that has this virus, you can use any kind of measurements, such as wearing a mask, wearing gloves, wearing any kind of protective equipment that you have access to sort of shield yourself and your environment from potentially encountering this virus. That's sort of the things that you can do. And on top of that, there is a vaccine, which is not widely suggested for everyone right now in Germany, just because the assumption is that we're currently not facing a pandemic that would easily spread within Germany. Also because of the fact that Germany has a very different healthcare setting than, for example, the DRC currently has, and also very different social structures than what the DRC currently has. Here, it's advised to be given to risk groups. Risk groups classically are people with weakened immune systems, also, for example, children or people that have HIV. Any kind of immune suppression would be a very bad combination with this virus. And then you have a potential risk group also with people that might have to have close contact with infected people where they cannot protect themselves.
So your research basically focuses on the spread of viruses, and you received the Helmholtz Investigator Grants and have been leading the Transmission Immunology Junior Research Group at the HZI since May 2024. What are the main goals of this research group?
So very, very broadly put, the goal is to provide some fundamental science research to increase our pandemic preparedness in case we are facing another pandemic that might become prevalent in Germany, with the, let's say, path to analyze how our immune system, either our innate or our adaptive immune system, is actually on mucosal surfaces fighting virus infections in such a way that it's actually stopping the secretions of virus or the exhalation of virus into the environment. So we're studying basically the interplay of the host with the virus and the environment to understand holistically, but also mechanistically, why or why not we are exhaling virus or shedding virus in other respiratory fluids or other body secretions, depending on which virus we're looking at, and what we can actually do with therapeutics, with vaccines, or with non-pharmaceutical mitigation strategies to decrease the burden of virus in the environment.
Okay. You mentioned the mucosa, and you have developed models to study the transmission of the Mpox virus via mucous membranes. What were the most important findings from this research?
Yeah, I think there were, let's say, two sides to that question and the answer to that question. And I'll start with the scientific findings that this research provided. So we set up a new small rodent animal model to look at different exposure routes to sort of investigate very fundamentally whether, let's say, mucosal uptake of this virus leads to increased disease and increased onwards transmissibility compared to, let's say, uptake through the skin. And we found that rectal and vaginal inoculation of the rat model that we developed actually really facilitated increased amounts of viral replication within that host, but then also increased shedding and also led to more transmission to naive animals as compared to skin inoculation, but also interestingly as compared to aerosol uptake of the virus, which sort of suggested to us that the outbreak in 2022 caused by clade 2b, which is the one that we used for these studies, was potentially not just driven by human-to-human behavior, but also because of the intrinsic ability of this virus to really love mucosal surfaces and get into a host and out of a host through those surfaces. And on top of that, we also found that immune signatures by T cells and B cells actually were variable depending on which exposure route was used, really suggesting that immune pathogenesis for this virus is different depending on the exposure route, and therefore suggesting that potentially vaccines or therapeutics could also be targeted specifically to the most prevalent exposure route that we're currently having a problem with. The second level was that it's actually very worthwhile to look into old literature, and even literature from the 70s or 80s sometimes, because sometimes you can find niche knowledge. And that's one of the examples where we built an animal model based on a single sentence in an obscure publication with the hope that it would work. And we realized that it worked beautifully if we're adapting it to the human situation and using exposure routes that are very relevant to what's currently happening on a public health perspective, as opposed to using, let's say, more traditional inoculation routes that would have been the textbook route to start with if you're wanting to develop a new animal model.
Okay, so you went your own way, and your work combines immunology, virus ecology, and virology. What are the challenges and benefits in this, let's say, interdisciplinary approach?
I think the clear benefit is that you can ask holistic and mechanistic questions about a whole process. In this case, for example, exhalation of an airborne virus from a host based on the immune signature of that host, looking also at how that virus survives in the environment and how it enters a new host. And we can look at all of them together. And that is, of course, really critical for the design of mitigation strategies that want to prevent the transmission of that virus. The disadvantage is that it's, of course, so new that there's no course or degree that people can take to study transmission immunology. And therefore, any student that comes to my lab has to learn a whole host of new information that they will have not encountered in their previous experience. And therefore, also the communication within the group of people that work on, let's say, more the ecology side or more the innate immunology side is sometimes not the easiest, because sort of everyone has to be aware of all these different topics. And the other disadvantage is that because we're broad in this, we cannot be super specific. So someone who's truly just studying the aerobiology of Mpox would get much more detailed understanding and perhaps use more refined techniques to go into the nitty-gritty of this than what my lab would do.
Okay, so you have also to do a lot of management and communication. What can we learn from the Mpox or your Mpox research for other viruses and for the future?
I think we can learn two major lessons. One is that it's super relevant that you have to have a structure nationally and internationally in place where research is robust, reliable, and also with a long-term vision. So it really is unfortunate if hot topics are dropped. We would probably have been faster with SARS-2 if more labs had continued working on SARS-1, but of course the virus was gone, public interest had decreased, the funding decreased as a result of that. And therefore also knowledge and skills are basically lost. So we were able to build up an Mpox model really quickly because we had a lab that was already set up to work with pox viruses, had a past interest because we were able to work with collaborators in DRC, and therefore we could build upon pre-existing experience. And that is incredibly useful. And it doesn't necessarily have to be your own pre-existing experience. It can be that of a field, even if the field had been neglected, so to say. And the second thing we can learn from it, that you have to address the urgent questions in as much as that you need to be willing when you're addressing them to also rethink dogma or rethink your experimental approaches, because we would have never been able to set up this animal model had we stopped at the textbook inoculation route, because it simply did not work.
During the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, you also worked on urgent public health issues. How do you see the link between basic research and rapid reactions to health crisis like this?
Yeah, so you basically cannot have a rapid reaction to a health crisis if you don't have years of fundamental research leading up to it. Because you need, like I said, this robust structure of people that actually know how to work with certain viruses or bacteria or whatever pathogen of choice, and have the infrastructure to then tackle the questions. And they're never going to have the infrastructure if they don't do fundamental science first. And I think even amidst the pandemic, you have a place for fundamental science because it won't be the last pandemic. So, even if the question is not the most urgent from a public health perspective, it's probably still very relevant or can be relevant in a couple of years. But my research itself, it is fundamental in as much as that I'm trying to understand mechanistic aspects of transmission, but the questions are driven by what we currently do not know and what we need to know to make human life better. So therefore, it's, let's say, fundamental science inspired by public health requirements.
How can we as a society better be prepared for future pandemics? You said they will come, yeah. And what role does science communication play in this?
So I think we as a scientific community can be better prepared in as much as that we keep this institutional knowledge, but also generational knowledge, and that, let's say, young people are not starting from scratch or trying to think that they need to rewrite what older generations have basically put in place. And I think that there is also what I said before, neglected diseases are only neglected for a certain time, and the work people do on them is incredibly valuable once they're not neglected anymore. And I think there we can learn that investing into what we think is not important might be a good strategy. From a societal level, I think we had a lot of trust lost and miscommunication, unfortunately, occurred during the pandemic because most people never really learn, for various reasons, how science actually works. And what is done to produce a publication, what is done to produce a white paper, and so on and so forth. And I think there some more fundamental understanding of how these processes work and being able to teach people to be able and strong in reviewing scientific findings, even if they're not scientists themselves, will be quite helpful to shorten the communication path lines. But also patience, because I think one of the key problems we had is that we moved so quickly that the knowledge translation from the scientific lab to the kitchen table at home was perhaps too fast in a way that critical steps in the middle or proofreading sort of was skipped.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of scientists can improve their own scientific communication skills, myself included, because it's not traditionally something we learn on how to rewrite our science into something that, let's say, my parents would understand. And I think that's a very valuable skill that we need to improve on. And then as a whole, what can we do to prepare? I mean, a willingness to potentially put the well-being of a population above the well-being of an individual. But that's a really hard sell if you're asking people to engage with mitigation strategies that feel over the top or untargeted.
So it's a very big challenge that lies before all of us, I think. No?
I think so.
Yeah. How did you actually come to this research topic?
I think fundamentally because my parents left some books in the library when I was still reasonably young, such as Hot Zone, which I found as a child to be very engaging and very interesting. I thought, well, it would be very fun to be someone to research emerging diseases that people don't understand. Funny enough, now 20 years later, I know some of the people that feature as characters in these books. And of course, the reality of what actually happened is very vastly different from what the book version would tell you has occurred. But I think it set me on like this path, and I did quite a bit of my time focused on tropical medicine, which is still where my passion lies, in as much as that I found zoonosis to be super interesting in the aspect that we have a disease that occurs in a reservoir, a disease that occurs in humans, and it's not the same. There's something dramatically different in the immune response in human versus the reservoir, which is super engaging in the context of why that is the case. Like, why does one die and the other survive? And I think we can learn a lot of fundamental aspects about immunology and good immune responses from that conundrum. And also because we have different exposure routes, and these exposure routes create different disease phenotypes and immunopathogenesis. And that's a super interesting question as well, of why our body is better at controlling something if it comes in one way than if it comes in through another. So I stumbled through a couple of chapters in virology, immunology, and then a bit of more ecology-oriented virology. And that sort of brought me to the point where I was like, well, it would be really cool to combine them, because then we can actually study transmission within the framework of also studying the host. And that's where we are now.
Is there any advice you would give to young researchers who want to join this field?
I think the advice would be that you can join this field from various angles, and you need to pick the one that suits you the most, because there's no way you're going to be an aerobiologist, an immunologist, and a virologist. And I'm still on the side where I would say I'm an immunologist by training, and I dabble in the other two fields. And I think you need to make that choice for yourself. What is your primary interest? And then find a question that you find really interesting, and then let the question drive your passion for that field. Because in my case, I hated immunology as a student, and then realized that the questions I want to ask actually made immunology fun and really interesting. And then there you have it. I think if you find the questions that give you passion, then you can get the rest of it lined up.
So I think you work very, very much, but do you have free time, some kind of free time, and what do you do in your free time?
Yeah, I take the free time because I think during the pandemic, a lot of people realize that if you don't, you're going to skid towards a burnout or going to have an unhealthy lifestyle. Because I learned from my past mentors that you work because you might enjoy work, or you should enjoy work. If you don't enjoy it, then there's no reason to be in science. But in my own personal opinion, but you also work to have a life. And I think that life is equally important. So yeah, I do have free time, and I normally spend it outdoors. I have various outdoor hobbies. Key featuring would be snowboarding, scuba diving, hiking, kayaking. I spent the last 4 years living in Montana, so it was quite easy to have outdoor hobbies. Now that I'm in Braunschweig, I'm reevaluating and have to figure out what we can do here. But you need that, because otherwise you're never going to be as productive in your work if you are not living a good life in your private life.
Last question. Do you perhaps have a few tips for our listeners as a take-home message on how we can best protect ourselves from infection with maybe zoonotic viruses?
Maybe 2 tips. One, for the sake of zoonotic viruses, I guess the easy answer would be don't go travel where the reservoirs live. And if you go travel where the reservoirs live, know how to protect yourself from engaging with said reservoir animals. If we're already facing human-to-human transmission, then my tip 2 would be don't put the focus on the person trying to not get sick, but put it on the person who's already sick and enable them to feel like they have the right to wear a mask, disinfect their hands, not go to work because they're sick. If we as a society would recognize that it's perfectly okay to be sick and be away from other people because we are sick and have other people pick up your societal responsibilities while you're sick, then I think a lot of the other measurements would fall in place really easy.
I think this is a very, very good advice. Thank you for the interesting information and for your time.
Thank you.
Julia Pott researches how viruses spread, especially zoonotic viruses, and how our immune system reacts with it.